So welcome everyone to our third kind of cohort section on EV readiness. In the past, and when we did CCA kind of 1.0 in retrospect, I guess we call it 1.0 now, we focused on just standards for private development, but we decided to expand this cohort to include kind of an overview of this kind of idea of EV readiness for cities, since we're doing a lot of work in that space and, working on, putting together this program and piloting this program. So that seemed like a good overview for the first meeting, and then we'll have a meeting in a couple weeks that we go deeper into the standards piece. So welcome, and as usual, we're gonna do some introductions, and we've got an icebreaker that is less personal and more topic related. We don't have very many people on. I wonder if we could do this not in the chat and, have people just say it, because, I like to see your faces. So your name, city, organization, and then on a scale of 1 to 5, like where would you say your city is in terms of being ready for the EV revolution, or as I call it, the evolution? I'll call people out. I'll start with Melissa Bartman.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Melissa Bartman. I'm with the City of Red Wing, the Community and Economic Development Coordinator. And on a scale of 1 to 5, I'd say we're at about a 3. So.
Fair. Awesome. Lauren.
Hello, everyone. Lauren Jensen, Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Rochester. I would say, I don't know, probably a 3. I think we've done a lot of really good work in the past few years, but I know there's a lot more to come, even just this year alone, that we're thinking about and working on. So we're getting there.
Sounds good. Let's see, John Howard.
Good morning. Yep, I'm John Howard. I work for the City of Winona as the Natural Resource and Sustainability Coordinator. I would put us at a 2, unfortunately. I'd like that to be much better, but I think that's just where we are with kind of availability of vehicles and infrastructure.
Well, I thought you were going to say 1, so I think 2 is awesome. All right. How about Drew? Why don't you just hop in there too? I know Lauren went, but
sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I meant I'll have to say Drew with a U.
Drew. I work with Rochester Public Utilities, Rochester, Minnesota, and I would put us. I'm going to be a little pessimistic compared to Lauren. Put us at a 2, because I think a city of our size should be a lot better than what we are. We're getting there, and I think there's a lot of strides being made by Lauren and Kevin, and hopefully we can encourage those more.
I was nervous going before Drew.
Sorry, you could have just said let Drew go first. Yeah, no, it's all good. Okay, let's do Drew with the EW. Uh-oh, he just turned up his video. Maybe we'll come back to him. Why don't we'll just keep doing the Southeast. Dave Wanberg.
Yeah, Dave Wanberg with the City of Faribault. I'm the city planner. And I would say we're in probably a 2. We've made some progress, but we've got a long way to go still.
Awesome. How about Annie? And then folks, when I get your name, Kelsey, you're on deck. If you can turn on your video, it's great. It's good to see your face and connect names and faces.
Hey everyone, I'm Annie Pottorff, and I'm a sustainability specialist with the City of St. Louis Park. And I think we're about a 3, echoing what some other people have said. I think we've done some good work, but especially filling out that EV Ready survey, it's clear that we have a lot more to do.
That seems about right. Kelsey, and then Maria, you're on deck.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Travers. I'm the Green Corps member for the City of Winona. And I would agree with John. I would say we're at about a 2.
Super. Oh, Maria doesn't have a microphone or a camera at her desk. So they're also a 3. They've done a fleet study, had meetings regarding adding EVs to their fleet, but still having some finance infrastructure infrastructure complications. They did install 2 charging stations at their city hall and community center in 2020, though. Seen them, they're fabulous. Awesome. All right, so how about Story and then Kelly?
Hi, I'm Story. I'm the Green Corps member with the City of Golden Valley, and I don't feel like I have enough knowledge to be able to rate us in a way. Yep, that's all. Thank you.
I hear you. All right, so Kelly and then Jen.
Yeah, Kelly Prine, City of Lakeville, and sorry, I don't have a camera at my desk, so, but I'm the environmental resources technician here at Lakeville, and I'd say we're probably at like a 1 or 2. We have quite a bit of a ways to come. We're really hoping to get the MPCA grant so we can get in some more charging stations, and then kind of go from there. So yeah.
Great, Jen, and then we'll go to some staff. We'll go to Brian.
Hey there, Jen McLaughlin, City of Woodbury Sustainability Specialist. I would say we're probably a 3. Like, we have a good number of EVs. We need to focus on our charging infrastructure next, so we still have work to do. Thanks.
Great. So Brian and then Chris.
All right, I'm Brian Ross with the Great Plains Institute. I'll be talking to you today, and I know a lot of you. Welcome and great to see you.
Awesome. Chris and then Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Chris Acuna with the Great Plains Institute, and yeah, I'm not with the city, so I won't be rating. I can rate my household. We're probably at a 2. We have knowledge. We don't have any of these.
Awesome. That's funny. Okay, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Heisel, and I am the Minnesota Green Corps member serving with Great Plains Institute. I will say that I live in Lakeville, so it's exciting to see that Lakeville is interested in implementing EVs.
Awesome. I think that's everybody except for me. So I think most people know me. I'm Diana McEwen. I direct the Metro Region of CERTS at the Great Plains Institute. And I would rate myself a 3 because I have an EV charger and an EV. I'm a single person and I don't have a gas car. I only have an electric vehicle. And that was a big decision for me to make, to choose, like, that's it. That's all I got. And I've had it for almost 2 years and it's just not been an issue. And I love it. And it's powered by solar. So maybe that makes me like a 3.5.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you need to claim more credit for that.
Yeah, that's at least 4.
I don't have any regulations though in my house, so ask my daughter. No regulations. All right. Well, thank you. I think we'll move on, and I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brian, who will talk about what is EV ready. What does that mean? And all of his work on that. So, Brian, take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. And here you just to see the agenda. I think everybody's already seen this, but we'll be spending a lot of time, obviously, on kind of the discussions among the cities and testimonials. But I do want to lay some groundwork. So if you can go to the next slide, Rebecca. And I'm going to kind of talk about what is EV ready. Some of you have already heard me talk about this, so, you know, try not to fall asleep. But we want to talk about this, kind of give some definition of what it means to be EV ready and where, you know, what is the context of that, and to provide some context of what cities have done based upon the self-assessment that a lot of you took and participated in. And then I'll add to it because we've had other cities take the self-assessment as well, and some other discussion even outside of Minnesota on this very topic. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. Okay, so and get them all up there. Thank you. So really, kind of, we've had this in place for some time, and I think most of you have probably seen this. But these are the 5 principles for EV-ready communities that we developed several years ago, actually, kind of to understand what does it mean for a local government to be EV-ready, given the kind of things that local governments do, the processes they have, and how they have influence over the kind of market transformation efforts. So the 5 kind of principles that we talk about are making sure that you have plans and policies in place that support electrification of transportation and acknowledging EV benefits. And this is things like comprehensive plans master plans, what we call functional plans, things like climate action or transportation or housing plans. The second piece, principle, is really related to ordinances or regulation, and that is recognizing that if you're really in a place to influence EV market transformation, you need to be able to affect the private sector, not just the public sector. So there are things that you can do to enable both public and private sector use in your regulation. Third is administrative processes. A lot of what cities do is approvals and processing permits and things like that. You need to make sure that those are in place in a way that it's going to be easy to do EV and EV supply equipment installations. You need to have local market transformation programs, and this is something that cities don't think about, and they don't know what it really means in regard to EV, but you do this all the time. Cities have economic development programs, they have education programs that they push out. They're a vector for communication to the community, as well as sometimes providing direct incentives like low interest loans. There are things that you can do that can be adapted to EVs and EV supply equipment. And then finally, public sector investment, and this is kind of where you're really saying, if we're going to promote this, we should be doing it too. And so your own fleets, your own parking lots, the places that you have direct control over as cities, that you need to be making that public sector investment. We can go to the next slide, Rebecca. So we did kind of take a look in terms of what people have done, and we kind of thought the easy way to do this would be to just kind of give you some snapshot results of the self-assessment that those of you who took it what you came up with. And kind of where we saw was that our EVs addressed in your city's comprehensive plan, we had a pretty good response to that, and I guess we only had 6 answers that actually completed this particular question. People who have not completed a comprehensive plan later, obviously, recently, are probably not going to have it in their plan, which is why probably 2 people skipped this. But we have the people who have completed a plan actually tend to have something in their plan about EVs, and that's a good first step. Okay, go to the next thing. Okay, so the next kind of category that we think about in terms of EV readiness, about actual practices, is the regulation category, and that comes in broadly in 2 flavors, one of which is not really yet available to Minnesota communities, and that is using your building code process. We have a statewide code, and we can't do much in Minnesota, at least until a step code or a stretch code is put in place. But you do have some influence on regulation about affecting the private sector with your zoning ordinance and your parking standards. So the question here was, had you actually incorporated this zoning, electric vehicles or charging equipment into your zoning ordinance? We have one community that has, and no one else has, and this is fairly common among the other communities that we've talked to. It's kind of a big lift, but it's really an important thing to address and something to think about. So it's an important category of action. Okay, go to the next slide. Another category of action that we've identified in a lot of conversations, and we've done this kind of working not just in Minnesota but nationally, talking to communities, is how you're working with your electric utility in terms of market transformation efforts. The electric utility has an interest in promoting EVs. It gives them a lot of sales. And so there is actually a real opportunity to co-market and to co-promote and even to do co-incentives with utilities, your city's electric utility, about promoting EVs. And so we have a category of questions around this. It's really good to see that the people who got to this question, most of them actually have been working with, or the city's electric utility has incentives in place. And then, of course, the follow-up question we would ask is, are you working with them to co-promote? And those answers would be a little bit thinner in terms of the yes, but this is a good first step to know that there are actually incentive programs out there that you can tap into as part of this. Okay, go to the next slide. Another category of action is what the city is doing on its own in terms of its own promotion. And this kind of goes to that 4th principle that I talked about market transformation programs that cities can do themselves. Are you providing education to businesses or residents on EV ownership, helping people understand and get over some of the educational and informational barriers there are to EV adoption? And again, it was really good to see. We had a lot of people who were answering this who were saying, yes, you already have education programs to businesses. We did this same self-assessment, I'm going to say, to a national group of cities, a small group that we're working with through our Sustainable States Network. And I will say that you guys are answering in a much better way, in much more prepared way than that group was. So you're ahead of the game nationally. But anyway, this is an important category of action as well. Okay, Rebecca, go to the next slide. And then this is what we call our public leadership category. And this is where, have you done things yourselves? We have several people who have actually put EVs in their fleets. Most of the respondents to this question said they have not yet. But there's obviously that can be kind of sometimes a laborious process, and we have ways to kind of help you do that. And Diana's been doing great work on that. Okay, go to the next slide. And this is kind of our final category of action, which is what we call mobility. And that's to recognize, and this is important, particularly for equity issues, that not everybody has access to a car. A lot of people are transit dependent or can't drive, but there are EV technologies that they can access. There are electric buses in a transit system. There are electric paratransit vehicles. There are electric bikes and bike sharing programs and scooter programs, and even things like shared ride programs that utilize electric vehicles. And kind of incorporating that into your concept of your EV readiness brings EV readiness to those people who don't necessarily own or drive their own cars. And that's really important on that equity question that we try to incorporate now routinely into most of the work that we do. So that's kind of a quick summary of what EV readiness means and how we've started to look at it in terms of an EV readiness certification program, which I'll talk about more later. So I think we're going to move on now to the kind of city experiences with the self-assessment. Is that right? Yeah. And Diana, do you want to introduce folks here?
Yep. Hang on. I think the first thing, sorry, happy on my button there. The first is for Oakdale, and Shannon couldn't be here, so she went above and beyond and put together a video that's great. I watched it earlier. So we'll just play the video from Shannon. It's great.
Can people let me know if they can hear this? Are we not hearing it?
No, when you share screen, you have to click that little button that says share computer video or sound at the bottom. So you might need to unshare and share again.
Okay, thank you.
When you're taking technical advice from me, it's bad news.
All right. Oh no. Are we not here? Give me one moment. So sorry.
Hi all, my name is Eden Prairie.
There we go. Are we hearing it now?
That was me.
Okay. Oh, that was you?
So I can share my screen and do it. Why don't I do that?
That would be awesome. Thank you.
With the city of Oakdale. Wanted to say a quick thank you to the CCA team for letting me come on and share my experience with the EV Ready self-assessment. Before diving into the questions that Rebecca had asked me to cover, I want to just provide a little bit of community context. When it comes to the EV Ready continuum, I would say that Oakdale is the very beginning stages of the process. We do have language in our comprehensive plan talking about wanting to support infrastructure to encourage greater use of electric vehicles. And we also do have a couple of charging stations in Oakdale. They are installed at the Hy-Vee, right off of the highway. There are a few level 2 charging stations and a few Tesla superchargers, But other than those charging stations, there is no other infrastructure in Oakdale to support electric vehicles. And the city itself hasn't gotten to the point yet where we are installing charging stations. Now, my predecessor and somebody who is going to be speaking later on, either before or after me, about her own experience with the self-assessment, Jen Hessbrook, she did a wonderful study in 2019 to introduce the concept of electric vehicles to our Environmental Management Commission and to the City Council. And that laid a really great foundation for why Oakdale might be interested in electric vehicles. I am also currently in the process of completing a site selection study to help identify preferred locations if the city were to go ahead and install charging stations in the future. And I will say that that site selection study helped me quite a bit completing the self-assessment. So the first question that Rebecca had asked me to touch on was the experience of completing the self-assessment. Like I mentioned before, because I am knee deep in this site selection study and thinking about electric vehicles in Oakdale's context 24/7 right now for my job, it was pretty easy to complete the self-assessment. I had already prepared just sort of a catalog in my head of where we were when it comes to electric vehicles in the city. And so it was pretty easy to answer all of the questions. That also meant that the self-assessment itself, I was able to move through it pretty quickly. And for me, at least, because the answer to many of the questions on the self-assessment was no, the actual survey itself was pretty truncated. I think that at the beginning, I saw that there were around 70 or so questions, and I think that I ended up completing about 30 or 40 just based on the skip logic and moving on past specific questions when my answer was no. And because that survey was so truncated, for me at least, I did request to see the rest of the survey questions because I was curious what would have happened if I would have answered yes to some of the questions that I answered no to. So again, for me, from an experience standpoint, it was pretty easy to complete because I already had all of the information at my fingertips, and the survey itself was very short because we were at the very beginning process of becoming an EV ready community. Now, because I had that full survey Rebecca sent to me, including the questions that I had actually skipped, it did show me that there are quite a few incomplete actions to EV readiness that Oakdale is poised to take advantage of in the coming weeks, months, and years. Specifically, those around goal setting, shoring up regulation, making sure that the administrative process is taken care of, and then thinking through some of the incentives that we can provide to developers for laying EV connectivity for charging stations. The only reason that I know that those are incomplete actions is because I received the full set of questions that I had even skipped from answering no. And so I appreciated having all of those questions available to me. And it highlighted the fact that we are still, again, at the very beginning stages of becoming EV ready. And it gave me a lot of insight into where we might be looking to institute some action steps moving forward to make sure that we're supporting infrastructure accordingly in Oakdale. To complete the actual self-assessment, as I said before, I already had quite a bit of the documentation that I needed on my own to answer the questions. And that's because, again, my predecessor, Jen, left a wealth of information. She was very, very good about cataloging everything that she had done to complete the 2019 EV study. And she also had wonderful drafts of ordinance changes and code amendments and various other things that she was recommending in her EV study that Oakdale do. So I had a lot of that documentation ready for me, and it was pretty easy then with that documentation to answer most of the self-assessment questions. So I very much appreciate her thoroughness from that standpoint. I did have to ask for a couple of points of clarification from our building inspection department just to make sure that Oakdale does follow the state process for how it processes permits. So that was a helpful conversation to have with our head of the building inspection department. And then I asked a couple of questions of our planner, but again, by and large, I was able to finish the self-assessment just with whatever documentation I had at hand. And last but not least, the self-assessment did sort of highlight a couple of priority actions when it comes to EV readiness that Oakdale had already been considering. I do think that it's very important before we install charging stations to make sure that we clarify the role that the city has to play in supporting EV infrastructure through land use. There's a lot to do from a regulation, administration, and incentivization standpoint. And we want to make sure that we have that really wonderful policy foundation to kind of lower the hurdles to installing electric vehicle charging stations for the city as a whole before joining the conversation with our city council about the idea of installing electric vehicle charging stations ourselves. I think that right now our city council is a little bit more hesitant to see the benefits of the government installing the charging stations versus encouraging the business community to do that. And so the self-assessment really highlighted for me the need to make sure that that policy foundation was really well set. So overall, I would say that I really appreciated taking the self-assessment. I sort of had a thought at the very beginning that we weren't going to be able to answer many of the questions, and that was relatively true. But it did give me a really good sense for where we have to go moving forward. And so we'll take some of those unanswered questions from the self-assessment and use them to sort of chart a path on action steps moving forward from here. So thanks again. If there are any questions, feel free to shoot them my way. Otherwise, I'm really happy to hear later on what other communities who are a little bit further along in the process experience with their own self-assessment.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that. Lots of shout outs to Jen Hessbrook in there. So that was Shannon, great presentation. So thankful she did that since she couldn't be here with us. And now I'll turn it over to Melissa Bartman from Red Wing.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you to the CCA team for having me here today. So my experience with filling out the self-assessment was that it was straightforward and easy to fill out. It didn't take too much time. I was able to fill out the assessment by myself. I didn't need to consult with coworkers. But that's primarily because there were quite a few actions that I knew we hadn't yet taken. Otherwise, I probably would have needed to connect with our planning manager and building official. So one of the things that I thought was helpful in the self-assessment is that it's broken into 5 categories. You have the policy, regulation, administration, public programs, and leadership. So under the policy category, we have completed some of those actions. So for example, in our comp plan, we have strategies that include building infrastructure to enable EVs, streamlining permitting to make it easier to install charging units, requiring all new buildings to have charging units, and developing a plan to convert the city's fleet to electric. We also have a functional plan, a climate action work plan that has strategies and actions aimed at increasing the adoption rate of electric vehicles. We have also completed some actions related to the public programming. You know, we have information on EVs and charging on our city website, and we host an EV car show usually every spring. And we also have a sustainability commissioner who's been hosting EV 101 workshops through our local community education district. And then we've also completed actions that fall under the leadership category. So in 2018, Red Wing installed a DC fast charger in our downtown public parking lot and provides charging for free. This past fall, we've conducted a fleet study to help determine which vehicles in our fleet would be good candidates to convert to electric. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to add an electric vehicle to our fleet here in the next couple of years. And most recently, we've taken advantage of possible funding opportunities that have been available. So we submitted a grant application to the MPCA for 2 level 2 chargers, and also been in contact with Zep Energy with the MPCA DC fast charging corridor. So we'd like to have more public charging units in the community. So we're looking for any opportunity for funding when we can. As far as financial incentives, we don't have much in that area, but the Red Wing Port Authority does offer the PACE program, and that can be utilized for EV charging equipment. We've also done some talk about the possibility of requiring charging infrastructure to be installed, or at least EV ready infrastructure on projects that utilize city assistance, such as a TIF project. We've had a couple of multifamily housing units that have recently went up and received TIF assistance, and it would have been nice to have had an EV ready infrastructure requirement. especially in our community, we don't have apartment complexes going up very often. So that was an opportunity that we missed. As far as actions in the assessment that have not been completed, pretty much everything that falls under that regulation and administration categories, we haven't yet touched. But we are going to be starting to. So this spring, we're going to be joining or forming a joint committee between our Sustainability Commission and Advisory Planning Commission to start looking at incorporating EV ready development into our zoning ordinance. Right now, our current ordinance doesn't have any language regarding EVs or charging infrastructure. We don't have definitions. We have nothing. And so this spring, I also plan on working with our building official to create a building permit application that is specifically for EV chargers and has design standards such as ADA compliance and so forth. Assessment did a really good job of showing, just confirming that those are areas that need to be high priority for us. And so I think that's really all I have. So thank you all for letting me share my experience, and I'll turn it back over to Diana.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it really helps kind of think through where you're at and where you're going, and recognizing, and maybe that missed opportunity will help you kind of put that in for the future, so you don't miss other opportunities. Great, thanks for sharing. So now we'll have Jennifer Hessbrook from Eden Prairie share her experience with the self-assessment.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Good. Thanks, Diana and CCA team, for this opportunity to speak a little bit this morning. Kind of ironically, after hearing Shannon's presentation, I actually haven't touched EVs a lot in my time since I've left Oakdale. So the assessment was helpful for me just to kind of start thinking about EVs again and kind of the whole picture of it. So I just have a couple of notes here. My experience filling out the self-assessment, I would say much in line with everybody else. I had a good experience. It was pretty straightforward and clear. I did end up asking a few colleagues some questions on some of the items, but that may partially be just because I am relatively new in the role. I think, maybe with some longer tenure, I maybe would have had a better kind of understanding of what we're doing in planning and land use and that side of things a little bit better. But overall, it was a good experience. I did notice in one section, I answered something incorrectly. And I think it was just a product of, kind of starting and stopping and going back in there. And I got lost in which section I was in. It was the plan section. And I think I was talking about the comp plan, but the question was about the climate action plan. But it also could have been that I was just moving too fast. So overall, I thought the assessment was good, and I really appreciated kind of that opportunity to start thinking about EVs kind of on the whole city scale again. So we had kind of a mix of actions that we'd completed and not completed through the assessment. We do have EVs in our comprehensive plan, and we also have a climate action plan that talks about EVs. And we do have some goals in our climate action plan around EV adoption, 30% of passenger and 15% of light and heavy duty trucks in the city to be electric by 2030. And then that bumps up to 50% by 2040. And by 2050, hopefully all electric. We do have some mode shift in there as well, around transit in our transportation goals. Right now, we have 2 existing public charging stations at city properties, City Hall and the Community Center. And this year we're adding 3 additional dual charger stations at 3 of our parks throughout the year. We also have a dedicated funding in our capital improvement plan for public EV charging installations over the next 10 years that the council has funded to kind of further promote public charging spaces. Internally for our fleet, we have a couple of plug-in hybrid electrics and a handful of hybrid vehicles. We have an all-electric police squad car that will be coming out onto duty in the next month or so. And then we're also placing an order for a e-transit facilities van as soon as that's open for 22 models. So kind of a good mix of hybrid, plug-in, electric, and then fully electric vehicles. We're currently in the mix of planning out our fleet replacement schedule to incorporate as many electric vehicles and hybrids as possible, kind of to meet our needs. And the mayor has been talking about sort of an informal goal around an all-electric fleet by 2030. As far as charging facilities for our fleet vehicles, our maintenance facility, we upgraded our electrical capacity to cover 32 level 2 chargers into the future. And then we also have 3 level 2 chargers in our police area, parking area, to assist with the new all-electric PD vehicle. A couple of things that stood out from the assessment that we need to think about more in the future is to how to address EVs in our land use controls. We don't really have anything in our code right now in terms of, you know, making an accessory use or anything like that. We have been successful in our planning discussions, especially in PUD proposals, to have multifamily projects install electric vehicle chargers. And there's been some kind of initial conversations with the council about, you know, if we would want to go forward and have a regulation around it, but we're not quite there yet, I don't think, at this point. A couple other things that stood out in the assessment. Need to kind of update our website a little bit with more EV info and resources. We do a pretty good job of covering other energy improvements, but not EVs. And then lastly, our financing and incentive programs, kind of how we can incorporate EV infrastructure into our funding mechanisms that we have in the city, and what that might look like into the future. So I think our priority for me that came out of the assessment was just to be, seems like we're on a good path in terms of our fleet and public charging stations, which is kind of the leadership section of the assessment. For me, I'd like to kind of focus in more now around those land use controls to allow, to be more specific about what we allow around EV charging and how, you know, the parking requirements fit that, the design standards, and just sort of if we could maybe move a little closer to having EV ready requirements in our developments. And I guess the last thing I just wanted to say about it for anybody that's on the fence of doing the assessment is just go ahead and do it. It really helps you think through the process and kind of everything that EVs touch in a city, which, as I was reminded during the process, is more than maybe I had been thinking about in the last few months. And it kind of gives you the tools to move forward and a plan to move forward. And that is all I had.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks for taking time on your day off to join us. Appreciate it. But then you got all the kudos, so, you know.
Yeah, I guess
it
made up for it.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. So do folks have questions? And then I noticed a couple other people jumped on after our introductions. And so I might, after this, ask them to introduce themselves, just again to kind of get an idea of where they think they're at on their EV journey 1 through 5. But questions for the speakers. Obviously, Oakdale, she's not on, so either Melissa from Red Wing or Jen from Eden Prairie.
If I could just jump in, this is Brian. I was like really encouraged to hear about the things that are planned, and in particular around the kind of recognition of working things into city incentives and affordable housing and multifamily development. That is such a huge step, and I think it's really groundbreaking actually, because there's not been much, at least in the Midwest, that we've seen in terms of cities actually taking those steps. So you guys are on the cutting edge.
I'd be curious to hear, you know, what's the motivation? Like, what got the cities to, you know, to go there? You know, is it staff, got educated, interested, and is kind of bringing it to their leadership? Are there members from the council or the mayor? Like, where is the motivation coming from to do some of those things that he's talking about that are groundbreaking? Because again, we've been doing some work, Brian more than me, nationally, trying to help cities think about the role for a city in electric vehicle transportation.
Well, for Eden Prairie, I think it's probably a combination of factors. We do have strong council support, which is very helpful when you want to start talking about adding fleet vehicles or funding in the CIP for charging stations. They obviously have to be involved in that. So I think we have a staff that's interested, and then we have a council that's supportive, and between the two, it's made it pretty easy and pretty exciting for us to move forward in EVs.
Awesome.
Yeah, for Red Wing too, I'd echo what Jen said. We have a very supportive city council, so that makes it a lot easier.
Do you have a sense of how they got, kind of, do they see other cities doing it? Like, I'm just trying to understand, because, if you got the magic sauce, we want to figure out the recipe to share the recipe.
That's a great question. I don't know what the magic sauce is, but we have 2 council members that were former Sustainability Commission members. So I think that just personally they have that interest. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't have any former Sustainability Commissioners on the council, but they have all expressed interest around supporting the city's sustainability initiatives in general. So that makes it an easy, transfer over into EVs. Yeah, I don't think there was anything we did specifically. We were just lucky enough to get a council that supports these types of activities.
And I've heard the Eden Prairie mayor speak at, regional council mayors meetings. He's really touting that. You said that he has a kind of personal or informal goal. I've heard him say it out loud about a year and a half ago. So he was maybe ahead of where other folks were on the city, but it's, there's definitely some interest there. All right, well, that's good. So I just want to, oh my gosh, I'm getting all these computer notifications. So I want to go back and have a couple of folks that joined us afterwards, since we still have a couple minutes here. We're a little ahead of the schedule, which is unusual. Folks that joined us afterwards to kind of turn on your screen and say who you are, your name, which city you're from, and if you had to rate yourself and your city on a scale of 1 to 5 about your EV readiness, where you're at on your journey, what would you say? So let's start with Lynn and then Drew Chirpich.
Hello, Lynn Erninger with City of Red Wing. I would say we're probably at about a 2. I don't know what Melissa said, but I would say we're at a 2.
I can't. She said either 2 or 3. I can't remember.
3. We're close.
Okay.
It's an estimate. It's a guesstimate. It's okay. All right. So then Drew Chirpich and then Allie.
Hi, so Drew Chirpich, City Golden Valley Environmental Specialist. I would say we're probably still kind of in the infancy stages. We've been thinking about it for a while and kind of planning, but I think there are some big infrastructure and logistic things that we still kind of have to figure out and plan for. So.
Did you get a chance to do the self-assessment?
I did not, no, not yet.
Yeah, it's a great tool, so I hope you get a chance to do that. All right, Allie.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm in the office, so I don't have a camera with my monitor currently, but I'm with the City of Inver Grove Heights. I think I would rate us at a 2, most likely. We just went through the Partners in Energy program. We are working on getting our plan approved, and that includes a lot of language about, like community outreach, but also, updating our city code and just being more conscious of this discussion. So I think we're making headway, but probably still at a 2. Hopefully moving to 3 soon.
Sounds good. Awesome. So any other questions for Melissa or Jen, and then we can let Jen go off on her day. I'm really glad to hear that the self-assessment really helped you think through what are all the kind of ways that a city can kind of be involved, and think about, okay, as you start, you know, moving further down this journey, what are the next things that make sense for you as a city? It's great to hear that the self-assessment was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing I just thought of, you know, kind of getting back to that question of what helps, you know, further the EV adoption. I maybe didn't give as much shout out to, you know, other departmental staff that aren't necessarily involved in sustainability. So the police had to be okay with having an electric vehicle in their fleet. The fire department, you know, all of those other sections of the city that maybe don't focus on sustainability normally, they have to have an open mind about wanting to incorporate some of these tactics in their own fleets, because at the end of the day, they do get the say on, you know, kind of what they use as their equipment. So that isn't another kind of essential piece that I think we have going for us in Eden Prairie.
Great. Any other questions for folks? Or questions you have for, you know, kind of the GPI staff around the self-assessment? Okay, before I get it to you, back to you, Brian, because we have a couple more minutes. I did say I was going to go off script for a little bit. I think I'm just going to take my opportunity now so I don't forget at the end. So these two sessions, this one and in 2 weeks, kind of focusing more on EV standards, are kind of, at this point, the last meetings we have for cities charging ahead 2.0. But I do have, you know, a little more time in the grant-funded work for this. And I've been thinking about, you know, are there other ways to engage and help folks? I've been thinking about two different things. One, I think maybe in April I might do a truncated kind of overview of where we went, you know, and talk about each of the sections, you know, kind of a high, you know, higher level, the charging, the fleets, and this, and a kind of a recap meeting in April for folks that missed it, or we've had some new cities, or if you have other staff, you know, maybe a truncated kind of overview of the whole cohort that might be, you know, interested, because I think Jen made a really good point about other city staff people needing to be educated and informed. And so if there's some other staff people to get kind of the cliff notes, perhaps. I haven't talked to I'm saying this without talking to any of my colleagues before I say this, but I'm pretty sure I can get them to go along. And then secondly, I do want to let folks know that Great Plains Institute actually is has a contract to work with both the MnDOT, Minnesota Department of Transportation, on their EV strategic plan for the state, and with the Met Council on an EV planning study. And we're going to be looking for some feedback on some of those strategies. They're including equity and all kinds of things in both of those plans. And I'm hoping that maybe we can squeeze a meeting in May to kind of share some of the work that we've done, depending on where things are at. I think we'll have some strategies for the MnDOT project to get some reaction from cities about kind of how that sounds and get your feedback, because you guys have been doing some work and on your journey, and you might be able to provide some really good input. So just thinking about that, I'm curious, put in the chat if you think either you or other staff members would be interested in kind of that recap meeting maybe in April. You know, we're, you know, hoping again to engage you on some of the Met Council for the cities, you know, for the cities obviously in the Met Council district, but then for the MnDOT strategic plan for electric vehicles, you know, a lot of thinking about the infrastructure, which should help support your efforts, you know, on your journey in the community that you're in. So that's what I wanted to say about that. So just feel free to write in the chat if you think that would be interesting. If nobody's interested, we don't have to do it, but I just was thinking about, you know, we've still got some time and resources. How can we be supportive? Or if there's something else that you think would be really valuable to hear from us, a discussion with the cities without presentations, or presentations you'd like to have, happy to have that as well. And I don't know if folks heard, but we talked, I think, about, you know, GM made a big announcement a couple weeks ago. We had Volvo this week, you know, same thing, kind of all electric, you know, in the near future. So they keep coming. We're seeing a huge transformation in this space of electric vehicles. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian to continue talking about the pilot program.
Okay, and I thanks, Diana, and I wanted to kind of, on the MnDOT and Met Council study piece, one of the messages I think that state people, and even the Met Council people, I think they're a little more attuned to it, but certainly the state people need to hear is from cities, is how cities can actually become valuable vectors for change to meet state goals. A lot of times the state people seem to think that the cities are only a problem and always asking for you know, getting in the way of things, when in fact they should be treating the cities as allies and valuable assets in achieving state goals, and kind of bringing that perspective to whatever feedback you can, so that they hear that repeatedly. Because I think if the state enables you guys to support your efforts at the local level, they won't have to worry about, you know, state stuff. It'll just happen organically and through the market at the local level. So anyway, just wanted to make that pitch in terms of work. Okay, well, I'm going to now spend a few minutes talking about an actual EV ready certification program that we're trying to assemble and put together and implement. We don't yet have kind of the funding necessary to do this, but we have, you know, kind of been putting together the pieces. And in fact, the self-assessment was one of those where it would be the first step that you would take if you were actually entered into an EV-ready certification process, would be to go through the certification to help identify a roadmap for you to move ahead. And in that certification process, or in the kind of EV-ready action process, are these 6 categories that we've come up with. We originally had developed them directly around the principles of EV readiness that we came up with a few years ago, but we've since moved on kind of with some additional discussions and put some more nuance on this to kind of see where are the real pressure points for local action that are going to make a difference in terms of market transformation around EVs. So here are the 6 categories. We've already gone through them. And as you kind of can see, an important thing that wasn't explicitly listed, but we want to integrate into each one of these categories, is the question of equity, because EVs and equity well, there's a lot of equity questions about EVs, and it is a criticism of some EV efforts that seem to focus exclusively on single occupancy vehicles as the means to do EV, and how we actually enable other lower income people or people from other cultures, you know, and other kinds of communities to actually take advantage of the EV transformation and the EV evolution. What is it, Diana? You said EV revolution, evolution.
Evolution.
Okay. Okay. Go to the next slide, Rebecca. So I just wanted to run through each one of these categories as you can see them here. We have the big broad category names across the top, but down below you kind of have some categories of actions, and these are still evolving a little bit, but we've gone through a couple of iterations of this. And this is where all those questions in the self-assessment came from. They came from kind of this categorization of action, of best practice, as it relates to the categories. We are structuring this whole thing very similar to the Green Step Cities program. We're going to have categories of actions. We're going to have best practices, which is what you see here in the columns. And then with each one of these best practices, we'll have some specific actions that cities can take that bring you to the best practice. So I'm going to run through that a little bit here for each one of these categories. Go to the next slide. So what is that first category, which is policy and goal setting? What are the kinds of things that you need to do? Well, what is a comprehensive plan that actually meets that EV-ready category certification? Really, it's about identifying the public benefits of EV use and market transformation, because there are co-benefits of EV the process. There are health benefits, there are environmental benefits, there are economic benefits that flow to the community in addition to the kind of greenhouse gas reduction goals that we see. And kind of acknowledging that in the comprehensive plan is really important. And acknowledging as well the community's interest and role in actually addressing market barriers. The third point we like to see, and this kind of goes to a point we talk about later outside the comprehensive plan, is setting goals for EV use or deployment, just like you would for any other kind of deployment goal, housing goal, park goal, those kinds of things. You need to think about what does an EV goal look like. And to, of course, as I just noted, address the equity issues of EV ownership, EV use, and EV supply equipment, EVSE, charging equipment deployment. Okay, go to the next slide. So here are under that category of EV policy goals and metrics, here are the kind of best practice actions. We talk about addressing EVs in the comprehensive plan, in specific area plans like a downtown plan where you can get into great detail about things like where are you going to put the level 3 chargers if you're going to have them in that plan. It's an element that should be in your specific area plans. Functional plans. Obviously, a climate action plan is something that it's obvious to all of us where the EV goes. But when you do a transportation plan at the local level or a housing plan, think about how you're going to introduce EV and EVSE in particular in your functional plans like a housing plan. And then finally, just establishing that benchmark deployment, or establishing a benchmark deployment, a deployment benchmark, keep on reversing those words, and setting deployment goals. So first is saying, where are we now and where do we want to be? And you can do that in one of these policy documents, or you can do it independently as part of another process. We go to the next slide. So you can kind of see the actions that would come out of that first best practice of addressing in the comprehensive plan would be adopting policies for supporting EV market transformation, setting EV deployment goals for your different market subsegments, and setting equity goals for EV. So our program would have, similar to Green Step Cities, identified the P1 as a best practice, and then have actions such as this listed as well. Okay, go to the next slide. So the next category is the regulatory category. And this is where we kind of talk about removing barriers to the installation of EVs and EV charging equipment in your city processes and ordinances. And then second is to require kind of proactively EV or EV ready parking in your parking standards or in your local building code when that's an option. Because we do this presentation to people outside of Minnesota, so we kind of talk about the local building code issue. There may be an opportunity in the near future to do a step code, we hope, but until then, we need to focus on parking standards. Ordinances and regulatory processes also protect EV charging access, so kind of don't park here if you're not an EV ordinance type of ordinance, addressing the specific elements around land use and traffic flow around level 3 chargers, and providing clarity about design standards and access and signage. Okay, now those are the regulatory issues. Can you go to the next slide? Here's the category at the top and some of those best practices listed down in the column, enabling the land use in your land use regulations, addressing parking standards, building code, the streamlining your permitting process, and then we pulled out specifically, even though this could fall under R1, but we want to kind of as an equity issue, make sure that we're talking about EVSE in multifamily housing. And I will say that each one, when we actually create a program, each one of these categories will probably have a prerequisite, something that you must meet from each one of these categories in order to be certified. And something like the requiring EV in multifamily housing or addressing that in some way as an action could be one of those kind of critical categories because it gets to not only the market transformation efforts, but also equity issues. You go to the next slide. Here's some of the kind of actions that would come out of it. We pulled this out of the best practice of incorporating EVs into parking standards. So requiring charging for employment centers when you have a threshold of more than, say, 20 stalls, because you do want to think about really small places and whether you want to regulate them in the same way, or for retail centers, or for integrating EV into your minimum parking minimums and maximums. Because this is a question that comes up all the time. If you put in an EV stall, and you're restricting it for only EV use, does it count toward your parking minimum that you're requiring? We would say that you should count it, but that's one of those questions. Okay, next slide. The third category that we have is working with electric utilities in order to transform local markets. We created a specific action area around this because this is a unique kind of aspect of market transformation. You have a ready-made asset and ally that may have some opportunity, and probably is, as you kind of have already reported, taking the opportunity to do education, to do promotion, and even to provide incentives around EV in the community. So coordinating with the utility on education to promote EVs, enhancing the opportunity for utility incentives through co-promotion, talking about some of the technical issues around EV deployment, like what happens to the electric distribution system when you start having a lot of market transformation? This is a big issue, and the distribution system is on city right-of-ways. So how do you work in partnership with the utility on distribution system improvements in order to kind of get to the world where we can actually not have, where the distribution system is enabling transformation rather than creating a problem? And then finally, making sure that you're working with the utility to promote the use of renewable energy to meet both the city energy and climate goals as well as the city's market transformation goals. Because if the more that we can power these EVs with renewable energy, the faster we're going to meet those climate goals, and the more it's actually going to increase deployment locally of your renewable energy system and take advantage of local resources. Okay, next slide. Again, here are the kind of categories that we have identified as best practices. Okay, go to the next slide. And the actions, for instance, on that U4 best practice, create or promote utility incentives for EV or EVSE, the actions would be specifically to market utility EV incentives to residents and businesses through city mechanisms, through your website, through outreach in other ways, etc. Working with the utility to create new incentives for EV or EVSE that may get to specific barriers that are in your community or specific goals that are in your community. The utility, depending on what kind of utility you have, has some flexibility to do this. And then finally, creating incentives programs with your utility specifically to address some of those equity issues, low income and rental barriers to EV ownership and use. Next slide. The fourth category of action that we would have in our program is the education and incentive work that the city itself would do, not with the utility, but actually on its own, to address specifically market barriers that the city is in a position to do from the standpoint of both information as well as education and working with other parties other than the utility to increase access to EVs. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. So the best practices that we have under the education and incentives category include hosting public education events, doing a ride and drive, right? A lot of you on the call have already done something like this in your community. Creating an EV web page that talks about programs and standards and provides education to people on your website. When you can drive people to your website or other people can, it provides a lot of validity. Doing direct EV and EVSE education of commercial property owners. This is a particularly critical area. Again, even getting to the equity issue, people who cannot have charging equipment where they live need to have it where they work. And this is something that working with commercial property owners is an asset that you can bring and an amenity to those properties, and helping them through the process and understand it is an important thing. You actually can also, as a city, provide financial incentives for charging installation. Typically, this would be part of something like an economic development program where you're providing low-interest financing or grants for businesses to do improvements to the properties. This is not an uncommon thing that cities have. Why not extend it to EVSE installation? It's an existing program. It's not a big lift to do that, and it can make a big difference. And then, of course, expanding local access to EV models and options is another important one. Okay, go to the next slide. I can't remember which. Okay, there we go. The action categories that we talked about for the best practice here was the financial incentives, where we talked about that using existing financing and grants for things like affordable housing and workplaces in order to create, that the cities may already have in place in order to create activity and to promote state and federal financial incentives. We may likely be seeing something out of the federal government. How can you enhance that to make sure that your people, your folks in the cities can take advantage of those federal financial incentives in a way that makes sense? Next slide. The fifth category is public leadership. And this is where there's already been a lot of emphasis in a lot of communities about how do you, as cities, in your own fleets and on your own public properties, actually advance and demonstrate EVs as a market option and as an important element. The kind of concepts we're talking about are purchasing for EVs and for fleet use, installing public EV charging infrastructure where you have control of the site, developing standards, and this is one that is a step further down the road, probably for most of you, so to speak, down the road, developing standards for using public right-of-ways as a place to put EV charging equipment. This is also can be an equity issue about providing public charging in places where low-income people or cultural communities that are difficult to get to are at. And then finally, integrating on-site solar and things like and other renewable energy resources directly with your EV charging. This is something, again, as a demonstration that there's a lot of benefit to a kind of an integrated approach between on-site solar and EV charging, and there's lots of benefit to it. GPI has done a lot of work on this, and it's something that you're in a position and a place to help do some kind of demonstration and market transformation around. Okay, next slide. Again, those categories that we kind of came up with for actions are the public fleet, public chargers, right-of-ways, and we actually put in this one, install employee reserved at EVSE, to kind of demonstrate that that you can provide not only for the public, but actually for employees to encourage them to buy vehicles. You go to the next slide. And some of the actions around what does it mean to electrify your public fleet, you know, it's not one thing, but first you ideally would complete an assessment, kind of a fleet karma assessment that some of you in this program have already done, to identify conversion opportunities from an economic standpoint. And that's the advantage of trying to sell this to your fleet managers and to your city council members, is that the EV assessments don't show where it's best from a carbon standpoint. They show best where if you don't do this, you're losing money. So this is a great point to kind of get done. Second is to adopt EV conversion goals for your public fleets with timelines, so that it's not just an ad hoc, when money comes up, we'll do it, but rather when do we replace vehicles and how are we integrating this new technology into it? And then finally, it's actually purchasing EVs for fleet use. Okay, go to the next slide. And the final category that we talk about in our program that really goes to kind of some of those equity issues we talk about is the shared mobility question or mobility options category. Recognizing and promoting alternative modes of transportation that not only increase use of electric transportation technologies, but also can reduce vehicle mile travel. Because if we reduce that VMT at the local level, because we are encouraging electric bikes or scooters, for instance, that has multiple benefits, not just fuel switching, but also kind of direct GHG reductions in addition to that, to the electric transformation. Incorporating all these burgeoning forms of EV technology and addressing the equity demands that we serve first the most vulnerable in our community as we think about the electric vehicle transformation process. Okay, go to the next slide. So the shared mobility actions that we identified are deploying technologies in your transit systems, which would include if you have a public transit system, buses, or if you have a school system that uses buses, what does it take to do that? Those are big lifts, but you need to start the process early. You know, a journey of 1,000 miles start with a single step, and you need to think about that now. Also think about paratransit. There's a lot of paratransit programs, particularly in more rural communities, where it's kind of dial-a-ride or van service and how you may incorporate electric technologies there. The electric bike and scooter opportunities is something that especially in the metro area, there's opportunities to take advantage of that, to get to both the VMT issue as well as the transformation area issue. And car sharing is something that a lot of cities are now looking at as a means of getting to populations that don't necessarily have cars to get EVs in place. Okay, go to the next slide. The actions example we have here are deploying electric transit, electric buses in transit and school buses. So once again, it's not a single step. It's not just about actual buying a bus, but first you need to assess your routes. Then you need to address and adopt the transition plan or capital plan of how frequently you replace buses and how this may fit into it. Purchasing the vehicles is kind of the thing you do after all that. And then finally, this is something that the Metro Transit has been doing, is looking perhaps at deploying those buses on the routes in your community that are most affected by air quality issues. Now, this for smaller communities, this may not be as much of an issue because you're not talking about huge differences. But in the metro area, there's a very big difference between some of the areas, and deploying a zero-emission bus on a route where it is already heavily impacted by air quality issues is an equity component. Okay, go to the next slide. So that's my summary of what an EV program would look like, and how we would kind of integrate this. The self-assessment, as many people who took it had noted, actually provides a lot of this detail and a list of examples of things that you would consider. We do hope to have at some point the kind of full matrix of categories, best practices, and actions outlined, so that the self-assessment would be tied to those categories, so that you could look at the matrix in order to see the actions you need to take, and the self-assessment would just be asking you whether or not you've taken advantage of them. So I don't know, is there any questions, or do we have time for questions?
Always time for questions. Questions?
Well, I would ask everybody, does this sound overwhelming?
Don't ask that question.
This is Annie from St. Louis Park. I think I have a bit of a logistics question with it. You had kind of mentioned it being similar to Green Step. Looking at these action categories and seeing how far along you're coming. So I'm wondering if this is something you picture cities filling out once and then just having it kind of to work towards as a general outline, or if you would like evaluate it every year like Green Step does, and there would be like different levels of certification, or kind of how you're picturing that certification process and timeline looking.
Yeah, the certification, good question. On the certification, where we're at right now, and obviously this is a fluid answer, is that there would be different levels of certification. Well, because Green Step Cities, of course, is not a certification program, but a recognition program, and it's a little bit softer on some of the recognition issues. We are actually modeling this more along the lines of the Soul Smart process, which is a national certification program for solar-ready communities, where there would be a little bit more rigorous review, perhaps, of some of the submittals in terms of certification. And there would be varying levels of certification that would be done. But once you have it, probably you would have it. Once you got to a bronze level of certification on EV Ready, you would be a bronze certified community. So there wouldn't necessarily be a re-upping every year, unless we did something like we did with the Green Step Cities program, ultimately, where we created a category, a Step 5, which was a kind of a one-year recognition of particular actions. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And we're familiar. I think we participate in Soul Smart, so it's helpful to have that as a comparison. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
And Brian, I mean, so let's say they get certified at bronze, but they do more stuff. They could submit and get higher up, right? You know, silver, platinum, whatever the gold.
Yeah. 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 And that's
titanium.
Yeah, titanium. Yeah, we go from bronze, silver, gold, and then we'll have to create the titanium category. But yeah, yes, exactly, that's how it would work.
Awesome.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, before we move on to the discussion portion, I did want to give you all a chance. We've been talking so much about the self-assessment, and some of you have seen it, some of you haven't, and it has changed since the last time the cities that we heard earlier took it. So I want to just give you a sneak peek at it so you know what you're getting yourself into if you decide to take it, which we hope all of you do. So like Brian mentioned, this self-assessment is based off of the 6 categories and best practices that he just went over. And as I mentioned before, it is slightly different. When Red Wing and Oakdale and Eden Prairie took it, it had 5 categories, but we have since changed it to 6. And part of the reason that it did change was those cities were part of a focus group, and they gave us some feedback, and we tweaked and refined the self-assessment, and it still is kind of being refined. So if you do have any notes as you're taking it, please feel free to reach out to me and tell me your thoughts on it. I would appreciate it. But so right now I'm just it's on Surveymonkey, and I'm in the design mode. So when you're creating the survey, this is what you see. I'm choosing to show you it in this mode just because it's easier to scroll through and I don't have to answer all the questions. But the basic format of it is that it's in these yes or no questions. The other day we were on a call talking about the self-assessment, and someone was like, there's not an I don't know, there's not a I don't know button, and I wish there was. But the reason we don't have an I don't know option is because this self-assessment is a tool for you to really see where your city is at, and we want you to go out and find those questions that maybe you don't have the answer to. So that's why we don't have the I don't know option. So we do have, as Shannon and a few others mentioned, there is this logic built into the self-assessment where if you say no, you'll skip over some of the follow-up questions, and if you say yes, you will see those follow-up questions. And the follow-up questions are more specific to that first question. And it will move on to this format where you see it asks you to give a brief description of the action that your city took if it was answered. So this self-assessment has about 90 questions in it, but if you answer no to a lot of them, I don't think there is a city out there that will answer all 90 of them. I will show you really quickly. I'll move into this. Give it a second to load. This is more of how you would see it once it loads, how you would see the self-assessment when you are taking it. So I'll just skip through the first couple questions. I want to demonstrate how that logic would look, because I think in some cases it can be a little confusing. So if I say yes to this question, it will jump me to have are your EVs addressed in your comprehensive plan? So I'll say yes, and it will bring me to this kind of more in-depth questioning where I can put in my brief description. And if I say next to this one, it will jump me down to a question about downtown neighborhood plans or specific area plans. But if I go back really quickly to the first question that we looked at, If I say no, it will skip all of those questions and bring me just straight to that downtown neighborhood plan question. So as you can see, you probably will not be seeing all of the questions that are available, but I will be sending out in the post materials for this meeting, I will send out a PDF version of this self-assessment that has every single question, because as we heard from our speakers earlier, I think it is really helpful to kind of have this outline to see where your city is at. And we also got a little bit of feedback that sometimes people were having troubles when they went into the self-assessment and then they had to ask someone, and so they exited it and tried to come back. Some of their work wasn't saved. So by being able to see all the questions that are going to be asked of you ahead of time, I'm hoping that you'll be able to gather all that information, and then when you're ready to put it into this self-assessment. So that was just a very quick overview of what we will be asking you to accomplish later. But I would like to move on now to the discussion portion. So for this, I think it's really helpful if everyone would turn on your cameras just so we can see if you're able to see who's speaking, who's talking. And I will be calling you out for this first question city by city to get your answer, just as a heads up, as a warning. And I'll just be going down the line of the participants that I see here on my screen. So the question is, after hearing this presentation and after hearing about these 6 categories, what do you think what do you think you would be focusing on? So the first person I'll ask is Allie, and then we'll move on to Annie from St. Louis Park, and then Brandy from Leech Lake. So Allie, if you're on, what do you think your priority is for your city?
Thanks. Do you have the full list of priorities that you could show?
Yes, that's a good idea. Give me one moment when I'll just backtrack. Sorry. Let's see, 2. Yeah, sorry, Allie, we're putting you on the spot, first person to go. But so these are the different categories or the best practices that you could choose as a priority.
Okay, thanks. Well, currently we are working on utility engagement because we are working with Xcel Energy on the Partners in Energy program. So I think that's definitely one piece of what we're working on. The other piece is public sector leadership. So focusing on our fleet. I think those are our 2 focus areas right now.
Thank you. All right, Annie, and then Brandy, and then David Wanberg.
Great. Yeah, I think what's standing out to me is thinking about under education and incentives, really providing more of those financial incentives for EVSC infrastructure installation with our business community. I think that the city has been building new electric vehicle chargers, and corporations like Target and Goodwill are also building them, but there's not really a lot of like collaboration or coordination to roll these out. And of course, I think it's important to provide financial incentives for those smaller businesses, like not like big ones like Target and such, that we'd also be able to bring them along together as we go through this. So and let's see here. I think also public leadership, continuing to look at our fleet and continue to convert our vehicles to EVs. And then I'm interested in the developing standards for using the public right-of-ways for EV infrastructure installations. I think we're really thinking about creative ways we can go beyond just the typical pull-in parking spot and think about how we could have parallel parking infrastructure, or just in general thinking about more creative ways and how we could do that in the public right-of-way that the city has. Yeah, I think that's it for us.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so Brandy, and then David, and then Drew with a W.
So first and foremost, I want to just state that we're not a city, we're a tribe. And there should be more in your presentations about cities and tribes. I know I harp on this, but it is something there. And the previous speaker forgot to say that there is tribal green step nations along with tribal green step cities. If you're doing one revamp for something, you should do a revamp for the other one, because there are quite a few tribes engaged in that. I only say that because tribes are good partners and tribes are good ways to get this marketing out there, and not mentioning them isn't going to bring a lot more people onto your platform. But with this, I see two things: public sector leadership in electrifying our fleet and putting the infrastructure out there for that fleet, but not only for that, for the rural community. And sometimes people don't like this word, but the environmental justice community, and getting that out there and creating that geographic and economic level playing field there. And also we're very touristic. So we're grabbing onto that green ecotourism to say, hey, you can make it up here and you can still be green in doing so. And then the EV policy and metrics, we're already almost done with our EV readiness infrastructure plan, as well as making that from a guidance into a policy for the reservation. So, and doing climate change goals and everything like that with it.
Thank you.
And I just want to hop in and address, Brandy, thank you so much for bringing that up. And as you know, and we didn't say it, and that was our mistake, we are looking at developing a separate program specifically for tribal nations. That is not as far along as this is, and so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and that we've applied for some funding from MnDOT to do that. And but I really appreciate you pointing that out. It's a really important distinction, very different type entities and different abilities, to work in those systems. So thank you so much for addressing that. And the plan is that we will have a separate specific program for tribal nations.
Yeah, and thanks, Diana and Brandy. This is Brian, and I apologize, Brandy, for not mentioning that along the way. And I think that it's not just also that we want to develop the program for tribal nations. We actually want to have the tribal nations develop it for themselves, and that's because we talk to cities all the time. We have all this data and everything. We know where they need to be and what their mechanisms are. But the tribal nations, it needs to be really much more of a conversation with the tribal nations to develop a program that makes sense for them. So that's kind of what we are planning to do. So thanks for mentioning that.
All right, so up next we have David, and then I'm now realizing that there's two Drews with a W, so the first one to go will be Drew C, and then up next will be Drew from Minnetonka.
Thank you, Rebecca. So in Faribault, we are touching on all 6 priorities, but not necessarily in a very planned, methodical way. So for example, about a year ago, our transit provider came to the city interested in upgrading their bus system, and I brought up the issues and we talked about going electric, and we pushed that, but we haven't gone about this in an like I say, a planned, organized way. So I would say a priority for us is really getting to a point where we have the EV policy goals and metrics set up with a work plan to address all these priorities.
Thank you. All right, so then Drew C, then Drew I, and then Jen McLaughlin.
Yeah, so kind of touched on this earlier, but I think Golden Valley is still very much in the planning and budgeting stage for a lot of the larger costs and infrastructure that would need to go in place in terms of the city fleet. We've been pretty successful at installing some chargers on campus that are more available for the public, as well as incentivizing EV chargers with a lot of our private developments, kind of using amenity points and giving a significant portion for things like EV chargers. So we're a little further along on the public facing stuff, and now we've got to kind of focus on the the bigger investments that would be involved in upgrading our city fleet and kind of getting all that infrastructure up to snuff. So.
Thank you. The other Drew, and then Jen, and then Lauren.
Hi, I'm Drew Ingleson from the city of Minnetonka. I would say that we're mostly probably in that red area, the public sector leadership. I know we've been looking at, I've been talking with our public works director, and it's been sort of on our minds looking at doing some sort of EV fleet pilot program type situation, but nothing that we've officially moved forward on. And also we've looked at public chargers and charging stations. So I'd say we're pretty entrenched in that area, and we're sort of just getting our feet wet. So we're just starting off.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are just also getting their feet wet, so that's good to hear. So let's see, what did I say? We have, everyone's moving around now. So we have Jen, and then Lauren, and then Lynn.
So for Woodbury, I would say public sector leadership. We have 8 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles right now for our fleet, and we are evaluating more, but we are at a point right now where we really need to get the charging infrastructure upgraded and installed before we can purchase any more vehicles, because we're kind of hitting that wall where we really need the level 2 chargers, which leads us then to the utility engagement. We're working with Excel right now on 2 of their programs. We are identifying vehicles to be evaluated through their program with Sawatch Labs, where they install the telematics devices. And then we are also just submitted an application for their Make Ready program that helps pay for the part of the infrastructure between the transformer and the charger. And so that's where we really need to focus again, is getting that charging infrastructure in place so that we can continue to expand our fleet. Thanks.
Thank you. So then Lynn, and following up with Maria.
I thought you said Lauren next.
Oh, did I say Lauren? Yes, I apologize, Lauren. Go ahead.
Thanks. I think we kind of have a little bit of something in each of these categories that we're looking at for this next year. We're really focusing on, in that EV policy goals and metrics, kind of establishing those benchmarks and setting goals to electrify our public fleets, our city fleets. So that portion of it kind of also falls under the public sector leadership. Additionally, we're embarking on an electric vehicle infrastructure planning process, so that we have kind of a roadmap set in place in front of us. We know we want to increase electric vehicle charging stations and overall adoption, but we want to know where is the best places to put that in our community. And I will say we are looking at our environmental justice census tracts within that analysis that we have here. The other thing would probably be regulation. We are, with our Energy Commission, looking at a few policies or ordinances related to infrastructure in multifamily buildings and any new developments like that happen here. And in all of those, we're very engaged with our local utility partners in these planning processes.
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, so now we have Lynn, and then Maria. And Melissa, I know you already went over your priorities, but if you had anything you wanted to add. So I'm not sure if Lynn is on. So Maria, are you there?
And Lynn is also with Red Wing, so maybe he's just not, because Melissa's already talked about it.
Very true. Oh, and it looks like Maria put her her comments in the chat. So it looks like, so it says that their priorities are in the public sector leadership by adding EVs into their city fleet. There has been discussion about their fleet study results and possible options, but there are concerns regarding infrastructure and the EV models currently available. They're also looking at EV regulation and have regulation and policies in their city code, mainly in the new development section that pertains to apartment complexes and businesses, but they would really like to potentially add more. They're also looking at education and incentive options for residents and businesses. Thank you. Melissa, I don't know, did you have anything that you wanted to add? I know you already kind of covered Red Wing's priorities.
No, not really. I mean, we will be looking at, regulation, and then under the public sector leadership, we recently had that fleet study done through Excel and SawWatch. So, bringing those results to our city council and trying to figure out when we can add an electric vehicle to our fleet.
We also have Story. I don't know if you're still on. You're not super involved in maybe EVs in the cities, but I don't know if you had any comments.
I'll just second what Drew said. So no extra comments.
Perfect. Just wanted to make sure. All right.
Thanks.
So I'm going to run back really quick to our other discussion questions. We have a couple minutes left if people wanted to weigh in on, so like after hearing about the self-assessment, do you think it would be helpful to your community? Or do you think that the certification program would be something that your city or tribal nation would be interested in? And would it be something possible to achieve for your city? So I'll just let anyone that wants to unmute themselves, and if they have any thoughts or comments, feel free.
It was helpful to hear that there would be different levels of certifications. So I think that, yeah, as we level up, and that it would definitely be something that's achievable. If it's not just you have to do all these things at once in order to be certified, that it seems doable for us.
That's equally for Leech Lake. I love it that it's buildable. It has some goals in mind and allows you to get your foot in the door and then use that as promotional material to push it forward, not only within the tribe or the city or the local government itself, but that regionally to kind of push forward.
I agree as well. I think it would be beneficial to our community. We're kind of looking at different pieces here and there as I mentioned within those different priorities, but to kind of have a specific roadmap or certification program to follow would really help just like streamline the process better for us.
I think for Red Wing too, it would be helpful, as Lauren said, to have a roadmap and to be able to show, what you've accomplished and, the areas that you need to work on.
I think it makes it easier too to translate that to the broader community. We're all familiar with this. We work with it every day, but like the Green Step Cities program, we're a Step 5 city. It's something that's easier to translate to the community when you're communicating these actions that you've taken.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think our city council always likes being able to say, we just made Step 5 or we got Soul Smart Bronze designation. So it would be a great thing to highlight like that.
That's one thing that I was reflecting on earlier, was maybe having this certification program would, as Diana mentioned, help in the magic sauce of getting the city council on board with moving ahead with EV, different EV technologies. So I think that would be one benefit of having a certification program.
Maybe we could skip to the last question, understanding kind of what you see as the biggest barriers to becoming certified.
I think for Leech Lake, it would be if something is too prescriptive, like if it doesn't have any variability, like you still have to have a standard to reach that level, correct? But we run into this with Green Step Cities right now. There's one tiny little thing that's holding us back from going from level 2 to level 4. We're working on it, but just don't let that be the barrier for someone going from the lowest to the medium or highest.
That's great feedback.
Yeah, and I think this will help, as you know, this program is still in the development phase. So having this feedback is really helpful now versus later, once it's already kind of set in stone, so to speak.
This is Brian. I'm wondering if, what do you guys think about this notion we had of having a kind of minimum, a prerequisite in each one of these categories in order for certification, that you can't just focus on one or two, but you have to do something in each one of them. Is that a barrier? Because Green Step Cities has something similar for step 3, and sometimes that has been in the way. And you know, and maybe it should be in the way. I don't know, but I just kind of was interested in whether or not that feels right to you or not.
Yeah, so that's some of the point, is that if you have these requirements that are stringent and you have to touch on every one of these things, all 6, like just say going back to the 6 priorities that she had up earlier, it may not make sense for that local city or the tribe to do step number 3, and they'd never do it, and thus you'll never get them certified. It just won't happen.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, and because I know that this comes up in both Green Step Cities and the Soul Smart program, is if it's really a critical criteria, we shouldn't provide any flexibility around it. Versus, you know, maybe it's not so critical, and in which case maybe we shouldn't be asking for it as a prerequisite.
Or maybe it's something that adds to make them a higher level or something like that. But who's making that decision that it's a prerequisite, that it has to be done to make this? And are you taking into account all the different variations, not only between your small cities, your medium cities, your large cities? You can't take the metro and apply it to northern Minnesota.
Yeah, and that's all true. And we wrestled with that quite a bit on the Green Step Cities project program design. Many years ago, I was involved in that discussion. There's good points.
Yeah, are there any other comments? Otherwise, I think, Diana, we can move on to our next steps portion.
All right, so next steps, if you haven't taken the self-assessment of your city's accomplishments so far, we would really like to encourage you to do that before the next meeting. Again, you heard from the cities that did take it, how useful and helpful it was to think through and where they're at. This was great information to hear kind of your priorities. There was a lot in that public sector leadership segment, as I kind of jotted down notes here. So it would be great. And Rebecca, you talked about, we can send it out with the follow-up email, the PDF of the self-assessment, but let's also put that in the Google Drive. So that's just there as a resource in the Google Drive where we have the slides, the recordings, etc. In that Google Drive. Oh, what was the other piece? Sorry. Thank you. And then, we have technical assistance available, through Rebecca. Rebecca's been a great Green Corps member. She'll be with us through August. We're super excited about having her on board. but Brian and I and others are able to help folks with this, and we do want to continue to move forward with this program. We think it's really good, and we want to do it here, but we would love to see this nationally as well. But so we are looking to expand. As I mentioned earlier, we're raising money for this and hoping to really get something in place. And it was good to hear that you think it will be beneficial. I think that in the future, employers, residents that are looking for where to move, and businesses looking where to move, I think an EV ready community is going to be a really attractive aspect. So I'm glad to hear that you guys are to see it as beneficial. We're going to talk about some resources, but I did just want to say that literally this morning I saw an article from Kansas City. They're doing a pilot project on charging on telephone utility poles, and it's funded, I think through the DOE or something. But I'll pop the link in the chat, and we'll include it in the follow-up. But it's interesting, one of the things was I had that right away, looking at where can we have more access to charging, and that has been something that's been talked about. But there's a pilot project happening in Kansas City, so I thought that'd be really interesting for folks to see. All right, so I'm just going to pop this in the chat. So the last thing we wanted to do, it's a really long link. The last thing we wanted to do was just, again, remind folks of the resources that we do have. We have a number of resources from Drive Electric Minnesota with regards to becoming EV ready. We have this web page filled with resources that again outlines those categories that Brian talked a lot about, and the EV principles. There's a link to that, so that is on the Drive Electric Minnesota page. If you're looking to kind of see those items, go ahead and do the next slide. We also, I think just in the last, 6 months or so, put together, finished this fleet study of 101. A number of you mentioned fleet studies. And there was a number of different ways. Some did it through Fleet Karma in the past. Xcel Energy actually offered that to the cities charging ahead, 1.0 cities in the cohort. And so they were doing that. So they will, go ahead and we had those, and then now Xcel and has a little, something similar, but it's SayWatch, although it's confusing because I think SayWatch and Fleet Karma are now both part of GeoTab. It's inside baseball, but so fleet studies. But what we did is we talked to all those cities that did those fleet analysis, and kind of asked, what are the highest kind of lessons learned. And so we have some of that information, and it lists a number of the cities that are on this call that, helped us think through, what are the things that you're looking for. And so here's kind of the highlight of that, and essentially more miles driven equals more savings, and, looking for those vehicles that take lots of short trips, and switching vehicles that idle a lot. So those were some of the top lessons, but there's a guide there. So if you're thinking about, maybe you aren't going to do a fleet study, here's, some of those kind of lessons learned from the cities that did that in the past. Also, Brian worked with a staff person, God, it's been almost 2 years ago now, with a summary of best practices in some electric vehicle ordinances. So if you're looking for, we really want to go into that regulation place, and we're thinking about ordinances, what are some, options? There's a report for that, it turns out. So you can look at this tool to help you with some of those EV zoning standards and develop. You don't have to come up with them from scratch. We've got, kind of this assessment that was done across, the country, looking at some of those ordinances and development regulations. So we have that as a resource as well on the Drive Electric site. We do have, and this came out of Cities Charging Ahead 1.0. We did recently kind of revamp it a bit. to include some other aspects, but this is just a kind of a basic, it's actually a Surveymonkey where you go in and kind of answer some questions, and it gives you kind of a high level, you know, what's the kind of charger you're looking for a particular spot. So this will help you kind of just, again, as a beginning step, kind of what is that, you know, what kind of charging station should you be looking at? And then along with that, more newer off the presses, if you will, we put together this guide to purchasing an EV station that really kind of lays out what are the features, because people were wondering, you know, it's not just about can we charge, can we not charge. There's a lot of features. You can have a screen where you have advertising, you can have, I mean, there's all kinds of bells and whistles for these chargers, and of course, that probably increases the cost, but it lays out, you know, what are the options that you can have, and are they available in kind of regular level 2 residential ones, commercial or DC fast charger, what are those pieces. So it's a great guide to help you think through it. And it's a 2-pager, and on the back end, it has some other resources as well. So just want to make sure you knew about this resource that we have on the website as well. Next. I think that's it. I put the link to the article about Kansas City and their right-of-way charging on utility telephone poles. And we'll do a follow-up with the resources, and always the link to the Google Drive in case you're not sure. That's where we keep things. I've added some additional articles, I believe. Seriously, it's, you know, it just keeps on going. You know, it is clearly going to be the EV decade. We're getting so many announcements and so much movement. So we're really happy to share that information with you. And hopefully between now and next week, I'll determine, you know, what I'm going to do about those other meetings that I talked about. I think for sure I will do a meeting in April that's kind of a recap, kind of cliff notes of the cohorts that we've done, because also as part of the Green Set Cities annual survey, we asked cities if, you know, what they wanted to work on, what they wanted assistance with, and we have a number of cities that are interested in electric vehicles beyond the groups that have already been active in Cities Charging Ahead. And so I'll probably invite those cities to join us. It'll be, you know, Cities Charging Ahead, but any cities that were interested in kind of getting the cliff notes and getting, you know, getting their feet wet and just kind of understanding what are the kind of the higher level around charging fleets and kind of EV ready EV standards. So it'll be, I'll be talking faster than normal, which I'm not sure is possible. I think that's it. Anything else, Brian, Rebecca? Anything else? Am I missing anything?
I just want to. I think it's great the work that's being done and the work that's planned to be done here. You know, and I'll say again that we are working not just in Minnesota but nationally on this, and actually you guys really are kind of at the forefront of a lot of things. I mean, a few places like California, you know, they're different worlds, but kind of in the Midwest and across, you know, kind of even the East Coast states, there's a lot of great work being done here that you guys are kind of leading the way on.
Absolutely. Again, we're above average, Brian, above average. All right, all. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you in a couple weeks.